Hi all, this is Nellie, Ordinary People, Saintly Souls. And we just saw how Jesus had to wake up the disciples who were all in a very deep sleep, and he himself was exhausted and on the verge of despair after praying in the garden. And before we can see the arrest, Jesus wants us to reflect on something. He wants us to reflect on the fact that he had both a divine and a human nature. He was as much a human being as you and I, as he was divine. And at that moment, in the garden, as we heard, God had withdrawn and Jesus felt very alone. And he collapsed. At certain points he collapsed, and he was really psychologically overwhelmed. You can almost say tortured. And so he was also, by the way, tortured by the idea that his mother had to go through this agony, and because she knew what was ahead of them. And when God withdrew, he suffered even more. And you can find that on page 275 from the Visions of Valtorta, called The Poem of the Man God, of the 5th volume. So 274, 275 of the 5th volume. He says he suffered from the withdrawal of God because separation from God brings fear. It brings attachment to life. It brings weariness and listlessness, tiredness and boredom. And total separation from the divine really, most of all, leads to despair. And Jesus experienced despair, like we do. And he felt very alone. He felt very betrayed and abandoned, especially since the people who were closest to him couldn't stay awake and help him pray. He was deeply affected to have to say goodbye to his mother and to pretend. He also found it difficult that he had to pretend not to know what Judas was up to. He had to pretend that he was still a good friend of Judas. And that night, according to Jesus, the earth was full of devils. And Satan himself tried to lead him to despair and into temptation. Satan showed him all kinds of torture, like he had done before during the 40 days in the desert. He showed him the tortures that were ahead of Jesus, what was to come. He made him think that, Satan made Jesus think that his death was in vain, that it was useless to die this way, and that it would be much better if Jesus would just stay alive and live a good life, be a good man who would preach and be useful to people around him. Satan also showed him that God had withdrawn, and that God especially had withdrawn out of disgust of the sinfulness of the world. So Jesus felt utterly alone in that night, all alone. He prayed and prayed and prayed, but it was on the verge of despair. He keeps saying that word. And he had only his human strength, because it was as his divine nature had left him. And with that human strength, he fought Satan by praying and praying and praying. And he says, and here I quote, "I defeated despair and Satan, who created despair, to serve God and to serve you, by giving you life. I sweated blood. I sweated blood to be faithful to God's will." And so then Jesus also, and this is a much longer part, but I only tell you in a few words, Jesus also wants us to meditate on what he actually went through, all the possible forms of torture. They were mental, spiritual, and physical. So it was not just one kind of torture. And so in the next video, we will be talking about Jesus' arrest and how he first is led to the house of the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the head of the Jewish council, the Sanhedrin, and what the conversations between them. I think in the next videos, what is actually the most interesting is to see the conversations Jesus had with the Jewish leaders, what he actually said, and with Pontius Pilate and with Herod, who was the ruler of Palestine. And the reason that we don't see very much of that in the New Testament is because most of the disciples had fled. They were not there. And Jesus later on says in the visions that it was the Gospel of John, that it is the Gospel of John that is the most correct and the most complete, because John did not flee. He stayed all the time. He stayed while Jesus was brought from one house, from one place to the other, while he was led to Golgotha, crucified and died. And so we know the most of what happened from John, but John could not enter in all the places, so he could not listen to all the conversations. So see you in the next video. This was Nelly from Ordinary People, Saintly Souls, reading from the visions from the Italian mystic Maria Valtorta.